Mama Watali presents Strong Women, Strong Men series. Today's topic, a dichotomy of violence and faith with an interfaith panel featuring Reverend Cheryl R.C. Hanna, minister of the congregation at 4th Avenue Baptist Church, Salima Versi, psychotherapist, spiritual caregiver, and PhD candidate, Women in Islam, Anita Brumberg, CEO, Canadian Antisemitism Education Foundation. Mama Watali is an Ottawa-based nonprofit organization with an international reach.
Mama Watali means in the absence of a mother, and it comes from the Bantu language of Luganda. And it was born after my mom passed away. Now, the organization is really at the core to serve Black women that have suffered personal loss, whether it is through loss of a loved one, but most especially because of domestic or what is sometimes referred to as intimate partner violence. When women go through violence of any kind, women just need somewhere to turn and talk to somebody, either in search of resources or just somebody to listen and validate what they're going through as they try to recover and rebuild their lives.
Mama Watali was founded to support survivors of gender-based violence and to create awareness of the challenges women continue to face.
We are doing advocacy work at all levels of government, from municipal, provincial, to national level, because women's rights essentially are human rights. And at the core of the human rights is the equality of both men and women.
Founded by Susan Namulindwa, Mama Watali has successfully undertaken several projects nationally and internationally, including the creation of a library in Uganda.
When I was a little girl, I loved to read. I remember being in a boarding school and splitting novels with my friends so that we could read. So I used this opportunity of being in Ottawa to collect books from my children's school boards, and with the help of lottery and volunteers, we transported those books to Luero and set up a community library. We were able to distribute books to neighboring schools so that they could use them to elevate the education in the area. We have also done community microcredits for women in Luero still and in Uganda in general. And we also were able to get school fees for girls. These are girls that will be high achievers for secondary school who would not have gone to school otherwise. So those are some of the things we have done in the past. Right now, our target market is right here in Canada mostly. Black women, new immigrant women that have been affected by domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or any kind of loss. So we are setting up community support circles. So we are encouraging women to get in touch and find just some either professional help or women that have also gone through what you're going through to support you. Sometimes it's just a shoulder to lean on, or somebody to say, you know what, I've made it. If I made it, you can make it. So we are really trying not to talk about being victims. We are talking about overcoming.
The vision of Mama Watali is to give voice to the lives of Black women in all its dimensions.
Well, most of us have seen or witnessed a situation that we know is wrong. We know somebody who is going through some kind of abuse, some woman who needs intervention, but sometimes we don't know how to do it. So we want to put volunteer resources together so that people know how they can help in a way that is helpful for the family and helpful for the woman or the women that are going through it, so they can move forward with their children. We are putting together resources for parenting. How do you parent? How do we parent boys and girls to make sure that the boys know that they don't have to be abusive this is not a power struggle, that they can have healthy relationships. We need to emphasize the fact that when a girl or a woman says no, that no means no. And there is no reason why, as a society or as a community, we should turn around and blame the victims after they have been abused. So currently we are holding a series of conversations. So these are weekly conversations around issues that affect women. I want to call strong men out there, strong women out there, but especially strong men. This work is not about women versus men. We need to hear the male voices. There is a lot of good, strong men out there that fight day and night for their families, that go out every day to protect their families. We need to hear your voices. We need to hear you add your voices to this work, because, the family is the core foundation of our community. So if we have broken families, we are going to have a broken community. So a family is the nucleus of the community. So if we build strong families, we will build a strong community. Jump in and let us do this work together.
I am an ordained minister and a retired religious studies professor, and it is indeed an honor for me to welcome you to this most important discussion, the dichotomy of violence and faith. This is very important to all of our religious communities. And I want to quote from two authors who have written a great deal about violence against women and the role of religion. Dr. Marie M. Fortune and Rabbi Cindy G. Inger wrote in an article, "Because religion is a personal and institutional reality, it is no surprise that religious teaching and affiliation provide a significant context for many women as they address experiences of victimization." Quote, "Through text, traditions, teachings, and doctrine, religious communities and institutions convey values and belief systems to their members. In addition, members often have direct support or counseling relationships with religious leaders who may provide guidance or instruction. Religious texts and teachings can serve as resources to assist those who have experienced abuse in finding safety and in the process of healing. Yet, religion also can be misused to excuse or condone abusive behavior. In the context of violence against women, religious teachings and communities will play a role. They will never be neutral," unquote. This evening, we have assembled a wonderful panel to discuss the problem of religion and violence and the role that religion plays in fostering it. But before we begin, I'm going to call on Talisa Singh McKay to do the land acknowledgement.
We gather this afternoon on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge that they lived here before us and keep living here now. Reconnaître le terrain sur lequel nous vivons est une invitation pour nous reconnaître l'histoire de la terre, des gens et de la connectivité pour donner un sens à ces connexions. By learning where we live, we honor the culture and practices of the people of this land and continue to be aware of and participate in the healing process of colonization and intergenerational trauma. As a woman born in this country to immigrant parents, myself and my family are guests. Je vous appelle à reconnaître que vous êtes également des invités et des gardiens aussi. As an organization that advocates for the support of Black women and families who experience personal loss, all forms of intimate and gender violence, and harassment through a historically patriarchal and racist system, we recognize the myriad hardships faced by Indigenous people. Nous reconnaissons comme des personnes, des couleurs également opprimées, que les ancêtres des peuples autochtones ont été dépossédés, se sont fait arracher leurs enfants et leur couteau a été dépouillé, que les esprits de votre peuple apportant la force d'avancer tout au long du chemin vers l'émancipation. May the spirits of your people bring forth the strength to move forward throughout the journey to emancipation. The patriarchal systems in place have damaged all of us, our families, friends, and our personal environments. Nous nous voyons à travers les yeux, nous nous embrassons et nous agissons. Nous ne sommes pas des spectateurs. We are not bystanders. As we celebrate the UN Decade for People of African Descent, let us remember our ancestors, those who were enslaved, the mothers and children who were raped and continued to be sold into slavery. May their spirits give us strength to uplift our voices as we continue their journey to freedom and equity. Alors que nous célébrons la décennie des Nations Unies pour des personnes d'ascendance africaine, souvenons-nous de nos ancêtres, de ceux qui ont été réduits en esclavage, des mères et de leurs enfants qui ont été violés et de continuer d'être vendus comme esclaves. Puis, leur esprit nous donnait la force d'élever nos voix alors que nous poursuivons leur chemin de la liberté et l'équité. Thank you. Je vous remercie.
I would like to go over some housekeeping rules. First, during the course of the event, you will only be able to see and hear the speakers. The chat box is available for everyone to interact, make inquiries, and comments. Questions to the panelists should be typed into the Q&A box. For those who would like to stay anonymous, you can send a private message to the panelist only and or rename your profile during the event. And now let me take this opportunity to introduce our panelists. First, we have the Reverend Cheryl Renee Chapman Hanna. The Reverend Hanna is in the 7th year of service at the 4th Avenue Baptist Church and the first woman to serve this historic congregation. Reverend Hanna received her Master of Divinity degree from the Princeton Theological Seminary. She was also awarded a Doctor of Ministry degree from the McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. Her thesis in the practice of ministry was entitled Revitalizing Worship, Designing a Standard Order of Service for 4th Avenue Baptist Church. This work positioned 4th Avenue to engage its 21st century community with an outward focus and energy. Exemplary is the church's work on ecumenical efforts to support an emergency shelter for youth. Cheryl is also the author of a book series entitled Lessons for the Heart, 52 Ways to Share God with Children. Lessons is a collection of sermons to children, which is part guide, part demonstration, and part instruction. If you would be interested in learning more about her publications, please go to www.stillhomemade.com/faith. We're also pleased to have with us this evening Salima Versi. She is a psychotherapist and a Canadian certified counselor with a master's degree in counseling psychology. She owns her home practice, Rama Counseling and Consulting, where she specializes in working with Muslim women and women of color. In addition, Salima is a PhD candidate and instructor in the University of Alberta's Religious Studies program, where she focuses on contemporary Islam and Ishmaelism. Within Ismaili Muslim community, she is an Al-Azza, which is a scholar, preacher, and spiritual caregiver. Added to these professional qualifications is a commitment to social justice and community service. She has been a board member for several interfaith, Muslim, and feminist organizations and speaks on and participates in a variety of projects and discussions related to Islam, religion, feminism, social justice, and mental health. She is also the co-founder of the Muslim Feminist Collective of Edmonton and a mom of 2 very active kids. Our last panelist to be introduced is Anita Brumberg. She is CEO of the Canadian Antisemitism Education Foundation. She is also acting executive director of the Transformation Institute for Leadership and Innovation. Previously, she was the executive director of Canadian Race Relations Foundation, a Canadian Crown agency dedicated to eliminating racism and maintaining harmonious relations across diverse communities. A recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal and the Community Program Excellence Award, Anita brings to the position decades of experience working on issues of racism and discrimination, as well as human rights, countering hate, and intergroup relations. Born and raised in Winnipeg, Anita is a lawyer by profession and was admitted to the Ontario Bar in 1982. She is presently working in the Ontario Bar Association on diversity programming and policy. She's a frequent spokesperson, lecturer, trainer, and media representative on topical issues of the day. She is a court-recognized expert on racism and extremism and has instituted and participated in numerous intercultural outreach and educational initiatives. Formerly, she was the National Director of Legal Affairs for B'nai B'rith, Canada, and Human Rights Coordinator for the League of Human Rights, where she coordinated the legal initiatives or the organization's advocacy efforts and was responsible for the operation and of the organization's anti-hate hotline and its annual report on racism. I look forward to facilitating this discussion. Just to give you some broad guidelines, we're going to discuss, first of all, sacred text and the different faith traditions represented today to justify violence toward women. We will then discuss the wider problem of spiritual abuse toward women committed by those in religious authority, including sexual abuse and indifference to women's suffering. And then we're going to ask the question, how do we counsel women toward wholeness and healing, especially if they are committed to their faith tradition? And then we'll talk about the progress in recruiting men and young males in conversations on becoming allies in the fight against violence toward women. And then Ms. Bromberg will bring us back to the legal aspects of women and violence in Canada and the things that we need to recognize in terms of rights and responsibilities. I want to begin this discussion with the Reverend Cheryl Hanna. Cheryl, we have known each other for a long time, and we have discussed this issue time and time again. And one of the contexts, a biblical context that both you and I are familiar with from the Bible, from the New Testament in particular, has been the context of the Gospel of John in chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, in which a woman is caught in the act of adultery and saved from being stoned to death by Jesus. I want to ask you, I think for many this is a familiar text, but I want to ask you about how do we understand this story about Jesus's intervention in the stoning of this woman?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Pam, and thank you to Mama Watali for this opportunity to talk about the dichotomy of violence and faith. And so I think in regard to this text, John, in the Gospel of John, first we have to kind of separate the casual readings and the subsequent interpretations from those casual readings of this text from a more careful the more careful analysis, the more careful reading. Because a careful reader is going to notice that Jesus does not focus on the woman alone, but Jesus gives as much or more attention to the scribes and Pharisees who have brought the woman to Jesus. To Jesus, the woman is equal to each of them and is in need of redemption as they are, and receives, as the scribes and Pharisees do, an invitation to receiving the new life that Jesus is making available. So the persons who are bringing the woman have made her an object. They have made her an object for debate and discussion. And particularly in the Gospel of John, we have to pay attention to the fact that the woman has no name. They think so little of this person that the person is unnamed. They have dehumanized the woman. So when we, in our interpretations, focus solely on the woman, then we are continuing that objectification and that dehumanization, which we do not want to do. We want to be careful that we do what Jesus would do, and that's be balanced and look at both those bringing the person and the person that the conversation is supposed to be about. So we have to think about the fact that the text, the Bible, was written without the woman's perspective. The book, as I love to tell people, was written by men, about men, and for men. And the glory and honor of God is that women show up regularly, receiving the grace and compassion and love that God can only give, even though the men would probably leave women out if they really could, but they can't, because the text is about God and not about them. So despite everything that they do, they can't leave women out. And that our job in interpreting that text and many of the biblical texts is to remember who God is and to interpret the text from that perspective.
I think the misuse of this text, as you are indicating, has more to do with this patriarchal idea that the woman is responsible for the adultery, right? And therefore she must bear the burden, which was not the case in the Old Testament. Both the male, the adulterer and the adulteress, and I stand corrected, would both have been penalized for having engaged in this act. So you're absolutely pointing out something about the grace of Jesus Christ, but the misuse of lifting up the woman as being responsible. I think the problem is also a problem of subservience, which is explicitly used in verses such as Ephesians 5, in which it says, quote, "Wives, be subject to your husband as you are to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, and the body of which he is the Savior. And just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands." What do we do with that?
Okay. So again,
Pauline writing, not necessarily Paul himself, but in the Pauline tradition, what do we do with such a text, which is often used to lift up violence toward women?
So again, the apostle, we have to do some careful, we just can't gloss over these texts and read them and say, oh, this is what they mean, because they often mean more. You need to give some careful reading, and you need to not pick just one verse out of that text, because the apostle is writing to the church, and clearly the church has a problem in disunity. There is some fighting going on in the church, and Paul is writing to a church he holds dear to try to fix it. So just like the gospel passage, this casual focus on just a few verses are what do the harm to women and to other vulnerable persons in our society, setting up a hierarchy where God nor the apostle would have intended, because it is the apostle Paul who also writes, in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you were baptized into Christ, have clothed yourself. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor male and female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. So the apostle Paul, there's no hierarchy. There's all of us, and then there's God. All of us, and then there's God. And Christ, representing God in these texts, also has no hierarchy intended. So, and then when you read these texts, if you keep reading, if you read all of chapter 5 and all of chapter 6, there are 2, sometimes 3, some people would say 3 times more requirements for the male than there are the female. But we never lift those up. The male is required to love their wives as Christ led the church and gave his life for them. Bet that's not in our vows, that you're willing to die for her. That's how much you love your wife, is that you die for her. And then it also says a little later that you're going to love her as you do your own flesh, because clearly you're not going to do your own flesh any harm. So that's who we're called as wives to love, is a husband who first has made himself subject to God, who is all love, all grace, all kindness, all compassion, all reconciliation. And so again, it's not a hierarchy. It's not a power struggle. It's that we want order, right? Because this church and these families are out of order, mostly because they're watching the pagans, not because they're looking at each other, not because they're looking at what they've been taught by the gospel of Jesus, because they're looking outside at pagans and the way their disruptive households are running, and they're bringing those disruptive pagan ideas into their homes. And so Paul is trying to straighten it out to the church in Ephesians. So if you and your husband, you and your wife have order in your house, if you have agreement on who's going to handle what, then you don't need to read this section because it's not talking to you. You figured it out. You figured out that the man cooks the best, so he needs to cook. You figured out that the wife is better with money, then she needs to handle the checking account. You figured out who does what, and you're doing it together as one. And that's the point, and that's the way it's supposed to go. There is never any way to interpret these texts as saying that we have power over. There is no power over. There's only power with. There's only power together, because together we're going to move the kingdom forward as strong families in our faith.
Before I move to Salima and ask her similar questions about context in her faith community, I'm always struck at the problem of patriarchy in the Christian tradition, and how difficult it is to erase patriarchy and its interpretation. It's the lens through which so many biblical passages are interpreted. And it is a longstanding problem to this, contemporary age. And I wanted to know your views about that and how difficult it is to erase patriarchy and move to a more egalitarian understanding of our responsibilities toward each other, rather than to be lorded over one gender over the other. What do you think about that?
Well, there's a few ways to look at it. And one of those is using language. if we look at the ancient texts in Hebrew, when they refer to God, there are male and female attributes of God. That God has a way of being nurturing and loving, and there's God has a bosom that comforts us. God, we're under God's arm. God creates us and supports us. Wisdom, divine wisdom, is in the female. The nouns and the verbs are female, and so there's this balance. But when Christianity entered the Roman and Greek system, a system that was, one, very patriarchal, and two, super hierarchical, then they changed the language. And again, the Gospel of John is a perfect example. The wisdom, the divine wisdom of the ancient text which was female. She roams the streets and calls out to you, is converted into the logos, which is a masculine word, term for word. So right from that, just doing that quick switch, we don't have any more female attributes for God in the New Testament record. And of course, Jesus comes to the world as a male in order to speak to the male population. And we make that as a mark. And so we don't have any balance anymore. All of our expressions are masculine. All of the verbs are masculine. All of the nouns are masculine. So it's really difficult because we're human. We're limited. And so what we do is we grab for power where we should not be grabbing for power. I mean, it's completely antithetical to the entire gospel message that we have power over. It's completely antithetical, but because we are human, that is the way we gravitate to it. And then, Pam, people like us are lucky because it means we always have a job, that we're always asking people to come back to God and to let go of power, to let go of what holds us from really being a part of the kingdom. And so I think patriarchal systems are an indication of the sin nature of human beings and our continual push and pull from the divine and the attributes of God that God would really want us to express.
Thank you so much. Salima, I want to pose the similar questions to you because of the great work that you're doing in counseling and in your academic work at the University of Alberta. In Islamic texts, are there traditional views that reinforce faith and violence? And educate us for a moment and talk about it and the uses and misuses of these texts.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, first of all. What a great discussion so far. I'm so excited about this. I am coming to you from Edmonton, which is the traditional territory of the Cree and the Blackfoot and the Dene. And I'm very grateful to be here with you all. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what I would say is probably going to echo a lot of what Reverend Cheryl just said, because I think there's a lot of similarity across traditions, right? Because patriarchy is the water we swim in. And so that's where it shows up for all of us. So certainly, I think the broad ethos of the Quranic text is one of equality, right? Again, this idea of like Allah, God as creator, and that the hierarchy only exists there, right? That human beings exist on a horizontal plane where we are all on equal footing. In relation to the divine. And so the Quran speaks often about humanity having been created from a single soul. When it does use gendered language, it talks about most of the time equality between peoples. So it uses gender as a framework for that. It uses race as a framework for that. It uses wealth as a framework for that. And really tries to break down all of the ways in which we try and create these power structures and hierarchies in our world. Like Islam comes in intentionally as an attempt to break down our notions of power and control. But that is the water we swim in. And so it still shows up. And so, for example, the verse that is most often quoted when people are looking for explanations as to why particularly men might be responding in violent ways towards the women in their lives, they will refer to a particular verse from Surah Nisa, where it speaks about men having authority over their wives, and one of the ways in which the later piece of the verse is read is that if you have issues and there are like 3 different things that you should try talking, you should try separating. If none of those things work, then you can. And then there's a word there that's heavily debated. And in a lot of traditional patriarchal circles, that word is translated as to hit. That if none of that works, then you can hit them. And then there's some debate in various schools of Islamic law about like, what does that mean? How can you hit them? How big can the hit stick be? How can you leave them? Like there's all this stuff because that's how patriarchy works. But there's also a lot of debate about like, is that even what those words mean? And so an alternative translation is that you should separate, like you should turn away from them, you should remove yourself from them, that you actually, what you need is distance, and like you should really just take some space, right? Like, which makes sense, right? And so it was this way of how do you work through these relationships? And even this idea of like, the husband having rights over is balanced by the fact that in various other verses, there are mutual rights and responsibilities in a relationship. In fact, in Islam, marriage is a social contract. So it's a contract between ideally consenting adults who can say yes, who can actually consent to this relationship, and who agree to a set of mutual rights and responsibilities. And much like Reverend Cheryl was saying, that then how that right and responsibility works out in the context of your individual relationship might vary, but that overall there are these precepts of respect and honor and trust that everybody has to follow. But the point of a social contract is that if it's no longer working, it can be dissolved without sin, right? And so that's a completely different context, I think, for a lot of people who are perhaps more familiar with sacramental contexts of marriage. But of course, that too can be used against women in particular contexts, right? So we see it used, for example, by men saying, well, I'm done, and they'll just dissolve a marriage, which is not how it was intended to be used, right? And I think that's the thing, is that traditionally, like when these verses were revealed, they were radical verses. Like these were verses that gave women all sorts of rights they didn't have. And you see those things kind of shift, and that the society shifts back into that patriarchal context. And I think the great irony a lot of the time is that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a person, really presents us with a wonderfully healthy model of masculinity. Right? There's well recorded evidence that he never raised his hand to anybody, like to women, to children, to the people that were in his family, that he was gentle and loving. He was a very affectionate husband, a really like compassionate and engaged father. He played with his grandchildren. Like there's lots of evidence. And much in the same way that Jesus becomes a model for behavior, for many Muslims, like that's how we think about the prophet, that this is the ideal model. And yet when you look at men who are engaging in acts of violence, they somehow like ignore that whole piece, right? And so I think that's the tension always, is that we have the possibility of a faith that is broad and wide-reaching and inclusive, that really pushes us to break down all of our ideas about power over one another. But we live in a world of human fallibility and human desire, and those things often get lost. And so we see that happen in the context of gendered violence, of family violence, and even of just like violence in the ways that we speak to one another on a day-to-day basis as humans, right? Like it really takes over how we interact on a broad scale. And I think that's still the challenge. And so what we've seen in a lot of Muslim communities is a push towards these conversations about, well, is that the only way? And why is that the perspective that we're taking? And, what about all these other interpretations that have existed from the beginning? It's not as though these are like just modern takes. Like we can find these in deep historical sources as well as modern ones. And so how do we draw on that history and draw on that tradition to help us re-anchor ourselves in a faith that allows for healing and hope and wholeness rather than the fracturing of community and family?
I can only imagine that in your counseling, that you have found yourself in situations where women have quoted to you what men have said to them in league with the violence that they have suffered from a sacred text. Is that something we see it in Christianity, of course, and I only imagine in Judaism and other faiths as well. But can you give us some specific examples within it where the texts are lifted specifically to justify violent acts?
Yeah, so this idea of men have rights over women gets brought up quite a lot. And to the point where, like women are just expected to put up with deeply violent situations, with incredibly horrible forms of abuse. That comes up a lot in my practice. I do a lot of work in trauma, and so I hear a lot of that kind of stuff. But it also often comes up in unexpected places. So one of my favorite hadiths, which is a saying of the Prophet, is that paradise lies at the feet of the mother. And I love it. I've always loved it. I'm a mom. I'm fortunate to have a great mom myself. And I'm very fond of it as this idea of, the position of women as bearers of life. Not that that's the be all and end all of who they are, but that is a valuable contribution that we continue to make to the world. And yet I've heard clients come in and say, well, my mother has used this verse as a way to justify her violence against me, verbal, spiritual, psychological, physical violence, that, well, you still have to respect me because paradise is at my feet, right? And so even things that we think are beautiful and wholesome and healing can be manipulated into ways that are violent. And I think that's the thing about spiritual abuse, is that it takes something that should be good, something that should anchor us, something that should help us find meaning and purpose in our world, and it turns it into something dark. And so a lot of the work that I do is to help women rediscover or reconnect to parts of the faith or ways of understanding the faith that allow them to continue to engage, if that's something that they want. And so often it's that I'm going back to alternative interpretations, or did you know that, you could read this word with this other translation instead and it completely changes the meaning? Or, they'll come in and say, well, someone quoted this particular saying of the Prophet to me about how, just the mere presence of a woman can inspire fitna, which is like discord, basically. And so, women should never be seen. And I was like, okay, here's like 6 other ones that say actually the opposite. And here are all the examples of women in the Prophet's life who were very much part of the public sphere and very much engaged. And like one of our major sources of reports of the Prophet's life is one of his wives. Like that doesn't happen out of nothingness, right? And so, and then I also talk about again, as a scholar of religion, I'm like, well, how strong is that saying? Like, and there's a science to that. And like, have we gone back and looked, like, is this an actual valid saying of the prophets? And what can that tell us? And context, right? Like, as Reverend Cheryl was saying, like, you can't cherry pick, like there's a context in which these things happen. And so that's a real thing. The only other thing that I think is really worth mentioning, particularly in the context of Islam, is that Muslim women in the West also face the additional challenge of Islamophobia. And so often don't feel like they can have these conversations in public ways. And so one of the benefits to my practice is that it's a safer space. Like, I'm not going to assume that because you told me that like your father, your brother, your mother, whoever was violent in these ways, or even, the imam at your local mosque, that I'm going to assume that all Muslims are like that, right? And I think that that's a real danger for a lot of Muslims. And it's one of the things that really prevents Muslims from seeking help and support. And I think for Black Muslim women in particular, then there's the added burden of sort of the racial elements of that. And I think how that compounds really complicates the spiritual narrative around that. And so trauma work takes on all of those pieces at once, and it is quite complex.
Anita, following up on Cheryl and Salima, let's talk about the sacred text within Judaism and the support of violence within by those who refer back to sacred texts to justify behaviors. What is your perspective on this?
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fascinating to listen to you up to this point, and I think that this is a dialogue that we have to find a way to continue. I think the same thing is true in terms of the text, the sacred text of Judaism. Of course, here in Canada in particular, we have a whole range of practice and how those texts are interpreted within that range of practice will tell you a world of differences. But no doubt about it that it was built, the text is got all kinds of signs of male-dominated verbology, if you will, but like as was just mentioned, you know, with a thoughtful approach, what comes through and throughout in so many different examples to me as a practicing member of this faith is how much love and emphasis and appreciation for the value of women within society as envisioned in the Bible. It's there. I think it dominates. Right from the story of Adam and Eve, for example. Eve is an equal partner. She's created from, well, it's questioned what part it actually was, but let's say the rib for argument's sake. An important part. If you've ever broken your ribs, you know how important that rib is. It caused Adam some pain to have a rib taken from him. But you know, when she sinned, the sin wasn't hers alone. She wasn't blamed alone for it. She wasn't the one cast out. Adam had to go with her. Serpent also had to take some blame in this. She was valued in the way she was described. She's given different. There's definitely gender roles envisioned right in that story, but the qualities that she brought were very much, and I think Salima, you've mentioned along those same lines, the qualities as she's described, it was very much thought of equal if different. And that role, gender role, gets developed as the Jewish people develop into a nation, right? But I think that if you interpret the sacred, there's the word I want, text carefully and wisely, you see that women were of value. It comes through by the wisdom of the mothers, and it comes through in understanding that there were prophets and queens that ruled and were listened to. It comes in, we're coming up to the holiday of Purim. Queen Esther was the woman that probably, I heard a lecture recently and I thought it was very true, instituted political advocacy that set a bar for women all around the world and across centuries, right? So I think you can find it, but that's not to say that we don't find justification for violence. I've been studying some text within our writings called the Talmud, and in there you will get snippets where rabbis are talking back and forth about advice. And, you know, again, I think Salima referenced the parallels to Islamic texts. Men are supposed to seek out every other solution, and hitting is the last resort, yet it does appear in some of the discussions. So we can't ignore it. When and you see times that, you know, priests see a woman praying and accuses her of being a drunk and some other choice words. The patriarchal attitudes do creep in, but I am a firm believer that what our texts have been written with a wise eye can be seen as a way to enforce the notion that men and women are partners in life. I might just add quickly, because I don't want to take up too much time, but a lot of it is a question of how the tradition has now been put into practice. So in Orthodox circles, for example, there's a concept called shalom bayit. Shalom being peace, bayit being home, peace in the home. And that translates in that the woman's role in the home is to raise the children, to take care of the house, the cooking, the cleaning, and the man's role is to go out and earn a living and pray and so forth. But and you know, we can have a discussion whether gender roles are a thing of the past or if they still have some value. And I think, again, that was touched upon. But what that translates often is a confused attitude that women have to stay quiet and stay in the home and put up with abuses and the roles that are thrust on them without the resources that they need to fulfill those roles. I think that's a misinterpretation, not an application of the teachings of our forefathers and foremothers, for that matter.
There's a line moving through this conversation with patriarchy and misinterpretation and the idea of at some point, how do we re-educate and help those who are stuck with these texts through the lens of patriarchy, to help them, because it's just passed on from generation to generation. If we don't figure out ways to enlighten and reframe how these wonderful texts, these texts are abused and misused. I want to talk for a moment about spiritual abuse more generally, because I know in your headlines, in the headlines in the States, we've all seen such tragic matters in which clergy have been accused and often convicted of abusing their parishioners, or in counseling sessions between clergy and those who are being counseled. And we need to talk about this, because I think people approach counseling with the idea that they're going in for help, or they approach their person who has the religious authority as being closest to the divine. And yet we see more and more cases where clergy are, for example, are very much involved in sexual abuse, and then other forms of spiritual abuse as well. Cheryl, could you speak on it, and then Salima and Anita?
So, okay, abuse is abuse. Reverend, Imam, Rabbi, it is inexcusable. And there is nothing in any of our texts that would allow a person in authority to use that authority to mistreat one of God's own. There's nothing there. So right off the bat, these people should be prosecuted to the highest extent of the law. The denominations and the ecclesial bodies should take the most severe of work against them. Their credentials should be removed, whatever, their titles stripped. They should be publicly shamed. I mean, all of that has to happen, which of course is part of the problem. We don't do that. But one of the things I think we can do to begin education is to address the hierarchy of the male pronoun that we have raised. I was reading something yesterday. It was a hymn, and the hymn capitalized he. And I don't know where that came from, this idea that even the pronoun should be capitalized because clearly it's God. Because so when we're singing about he. There was no name, there is no Muhammad, there is no Jesus, there is no Elijah, there is no Abraham. It's just he. So I keep singing he, and I elevate he to be close to the divine, rather than Muhammad, rather than Jesus, rather than the rabbi, rather than Abraham. So part of it is the way we use language. And there have been some recent attempts to roll back the male pronoun and to use the name. If you mean Jesus, say Jesus. Because the scripture says it is at the name of Jesus. It doesn't say anything about the name of he. It ain't he that's going to do it. It's Jesus that's going to do it if you're Christian. So if we roll back the use of he and try to be more intentional about using Jesus, using Savior, using Redeemer, if you mean God, say God, not he. God is not male nor female. Those who must worship God in spirit and in truth. So there's no male God. There's Jesus, there's God, and there's Holy Spirit, which of course has no gender at all. And we give that he. We say Holy Spirit he. So I think some of the beginning is being intentional. And there are seminaries that you can attend now where they do not allow the use of male pronouns for the divine. And so that begins to just roll it back a little bit. It's not taking anything. A challenge that I would offer Christians is try to sing your favorite hymn and don't say he. You'll find out it's a lot easier than you think. You put Christ, you put God, you put Jesus. And so then I can begin to really internalize that it's Jesus that is at the top of this pyramid, not he. Because he could be James or Charlie or, anybody. We don't, George. We're not worshiping he. We're worshiping God who is living and loving. So I think that's the beginning of starting to use non-gender language for the divine, but also recognizing we're going to get pushback on both ends of the spectrum, as Salima said. Salima has said our mothers are going to push back, and our fathers are going to push back. And I think what we can say to them is we're not dishonoring the Savior. We're not dishonoring God. We're using the name and we're putting power in the name of Jesus rather than power in the pronoun, which again, that could be anybody. God is neither male nor female. God is God.
I think you raised a very important issue. And I want to take it a little bit further. Salima, how profound is the trauma that parishioners suffer when they have been abused by someone in authority? Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah. So spiritual abuse and spiritual healing is one of my areas of specialization, because it's where psych and religion come together. And the thing about spiritual abuse is that, all trauma will rupture your sense of meaning in some way. But spiritual abuse, really just pulls the rug out from under you, right? You've used this as a system to make meaning of your world your whole life, right? Everything you know about how the world works, how the universe operates, what people's purpose is, what your role in society is, how you what your relationships to your family should, everything. It affects everything, right? Because that quote that you began with, this idea that these are the systems that we use to frame our whole lives. And so spiritual abuse, it is just so insidious. It gets into every nook and cranny. And they see it over and over and over and over again, right? And sometimes that abuse happens in these small, like things that we don't think about, the subtle ways in which language impacts our ability to think of the divine beyond a gendered form, right? Like Islam believes in this idea of ultimate monotheism, like Allah as the thing that is above and beyond all human conception, and that like gendered language is a human construct that traps us. And so it limits our ability to think of Allah in all the ways that Allah exists, right? And in this thing that is actually beyond human comprehension, right? And we get stuck in the trap of how my brain can compute this. So I think there's those subtle ways, and then there's like really overt things that happen, right? So women who are being abused in the home going to their local mosque and being told, well, you have to stay with him and your obligation is to stay. And they'll quote, like I said, all these verses to try and support that, right? Or as someone who practices in mental health, people who are struggling with mental health issues being told that they have been possessed, which is like really ironically super un-Islamic. Like Muslims have been doing psychology for hundreds of years. The first psychiatric hospital in the world that we have documented was founded by Muslims in Baghdad in like the 9th century. And yet we still have these conversations for some reason in your local mosque. And so people have gone to the mosque and basically had these exorcisms, more or less, performed on them, which are deeply harmful because they're struggling with anxiety or because they have depression, or like moms who are experiencing postpartum, or you know what I mean? Like I've heard those stories. And then there's these really extreme narratives of, like an imam who has a woman that's coming for counseling, or as a student, or as someone who wants to learn about the text or the language, and who has groomed her over time and then become very abusive. And in Muslim communities in particular, like there is this tension right now because we're only just getting to the point where women feel comfortable enough in Western legal structures to say, actually, I'm going to take this with me to court. So we're seeing a lot more of that, I'd say in the last 5 years in particular. But then they're also on the flip side being charged by the community, like through social media and all these things, as like stoking the flames of Islamophobia, because like, you know, you're airing our dirty laundry, and how can you do this? And, you know, everyone's already against Muslims and you're just making it worse. And, you know, and on top of this is a respected figure and he obviously wouldn't have, and all the standard narratives and all the usual victim blaming, right? And so that's the thing. Those are the messages that we get all the time. So even if you're not the woman to whom this happened, you have been a friend with her. And if you haven't been her friend, you know a friend. And if you don't know a friend, then you saw it on social media. And so we're just exposed to this bombardment of all of these places where women are told that their spiritual experience and the harm that has been done to them is not real and not valid. And how can you come away without scars from that? Right? Like, of course that's going to affect you. And so, like a lot of the work that I do is, first of all, allowing women to rage and grieve because there's just no space for that. And then really about helping us to figure out, like, look, this is still really like, and a lot of the women that come to me tell me, like, this is still really important to me. Like, I miss my relationship with Allah. I want that closeness. I want to feel that connection. I miss community, but I'm so angry and I'm so hurt and I don't know how to get there. And so a lot of the work that we do is, giving space to those feelings and then finding ways to re-articulate faith that are whole and healing and authentic to where they are. I do the same thing in queer communities, right? We see a lot of the same kind of spiritual abuse happen with queer folks, and how the gender bonding and the gender dichotomy is so difficult for them and makes faith so challenging in the ways that they've been told that they don't fit and they don't belong. And so that's the thing, right? Like, anybody who doesn't fit this very narrow box suddenly has nowhere to go. And it really ruptures your sense of meaning in the world. And it takes a lot of work to build that back. But I will say that when women come out on the other side, when queer folks come out on the other side, like, it's a stronger faith, right? Because you've gone through this fire and you're sure. that like, these are the ground I'm standing on is sturdy. And that's a really powerful thing. And that's what I've seen build in the community over time. Particularly right now, like that's what I've been seeing in the portions of the community that I engage in. And I think there's a lot of hope in that. That actually through solidarity and through making space for these voices, we can get to a place that's better.
Anita, in what ways do you think women who have suffered these, various forms of spiritual abuse, in what ways do you think it inhibits their ability to actually do something legally, call the police or file charges? Because this, again, goes to the core of the identity and the shape of the home. Talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I would like to say that, the struggles that my colleagues here have talked about manifest itself within the Jewish community. All too often, I've personally seen too much sweeping under the rug when there's especially in the more Orthodox circles, a reverence for the male rabbi, and he can do no wrong, and you can't question him. And we've seen very public cases where that rabbi has done wrong, and it's, he's shifted out of the community instead of facing the justice and the community calling him out for it. And I've seen actually some personal examples of it that leave me shaking. But I think times are changing there too, because even in our Orthodox circles, women are taking on leadership roles. We now have female Orthodox rabbis. I might not have been a lawyer. I might have been a rabbi. Had that been an option for me when I was younger. At least that's what my mom said. But may she rest in peace. But so, and the other thing that's changing is that women are taking on more professions, even in the more Orthodox communities, having their own resources. I saw one study that said that Jewish women, especially the more Orthodox, were more likely to stay in an abusive relationship than the average. And that's partly because of the resources, but it's also that concept that I talked about, Shalom Bayit. If you go out to the community and out your husband and the rabbi, then you've brought shame onto the community, and that's a very powerful voice, a silencing voice. But I think changes are coming because we do have women counselors and rabbis, and more and more Jewish-based or Jewish sensitive resources to turn to, such as women's shelters and social services. I think the days of sweeping it under the rug in the name of not embarrassing the community might be on the way down. Now there is, but back to your question, sorry to divert, but I couldn't help but give my 10 cents after hearing the brilliant remarks before me. But we see the same parallel and the same kind of struggle in the legal system. I could talk to you for the next hour on this, and obviously we don't have the time, so you'll excuse me when I pare it really down into a short paragraph at most. But I think you can see that we've had the same struggles. It's a male-dominated world out there, especially in the policing world. That's changing too, as women are coming onto the force. I hope that they don't fall into the same traps, but let's leave that discussion for another day. Our laws for the struggle for women's votes was just a small smidgen of trying to change the system. The federal criminal laws that made women a second class, essentially, pretty much stayed unchanged until about the 80s. Until the 80s, we had the only remedy really for a sexual assault, as we now look at it, was rape. And rape had a very defining, rigid category. women had very limited ability to testify against the man. Court case after court case certainly verified that a woman's voice alone would never get a rapist convicted. Starting in around the 90s, we start seeing that changing. Now, for example, it's not rape that is the primary charge, it's sexual assault, and it's treated like any other assault with the special provisions that come with that particular offense. We're struggling now with just how much of a balance there is between the accused and the complainant, and how sensitive we can be in the court system with the evidence that women are giving. And again, it's a long discussion, and I don't think we have the time now, but we still have ways to go. Some of the cases that you've heard in the media in the last while, I think will tell you that we're still struggling around what consent means. There were recent case law that, that took away this concept that just because you're drunk didn't mean that you automatically consented, right? We're still struggling with it. We're also struggling with judges and court officials that have the wrong mindsets and need to be retrained. We see this in sexual assault cases. We see this in insensitivity and intolerance to women of different faith, to Indigenous women. I've seen some horrific remarks from our judges to Indigenous communities members. We've got a ways to go, but I always like to bring in the good news that there are changes afoot. There was Bill C, I hope I'm saying the number right, 51, that started introducing certain changes to the way evidence is giving. Now, that's not to say that the struggle is over, because lawyers for the accused are arguing that that's giving an unfair advantage to women, largely women, over the accused. But we have a dialogue open, and I'm within the legal system, and I will take that as a positive, knowing that we've got a lot more work to do to overcome what is essentially a male-dominated profession and always has been, but hopefully times are changing. And it has to change, because if you look at the stats, especially in this age of pandemic, trauma, the numbers of sexual assaults are going up and up, and it's frightening. And women are still scared to speak out, fearing that they're going to lose their economic base, fearing that they're going to lose their connection to their children, knowing that they may be shuffled into less than ideal situations in women's shelters, especially now in the midst of a pandemic. Would you want to put your children into such a situation? Never mind putting yourself at risk. So the struggle has to go on. And I guess, as a way of summing it up, I believe that clergy can be and should be at the forefront of making those changes, because, as we've discussed, the tools are there. They should have the open doors to their congregants. They can be an ameliorating balance between this concept of keeping the family together, but trying to end the cycle of balance. They're in a unique position to make a difference, but I think, like other people in power, they need the right tools. I'm just going to mention that there are a number of groups that are working on getting those tools together. I'm with a small group at the National Council of Jewish Women that are putting together a resource. It's been an ongoing progress and project, and the pandemic hasn't helped, but we've hoped to have a resource out about domestic violence in the context of religion, and what clergy can do and the resources available to make a difference. So let's hope for the positive, that this kind of dialogue will make a difference.
Absolutely. In the last few minutes that we have, Cheryl, talk about bringing men on as allies. how we can continually keep that conversation and have a more collaborative understanding that violence affects everyone, not just the individual woman, but the entire community, the church, the congregation, the mosque, the synagogue. Violence is not just about the individuals involved. And so we need to think about how to bring more allies into, as Anita is alluding to deal with this problem.
I think at the beginning, our founder said it well, that if the family is the core of our society, when the family is broken, then the society is broken. So I think that a part of our job as professional clergy, as representatives of the divine in all of our faith, we have to take that more seriously and look at the effects, be honest, have our eyes open to the effects that our narrow interpretations of ancient texts and sacred texts have had. And while we are open to women to be doctors and to be lawyers, and we have women in every sphere, we also have to think about women in the religious sphere and say, okay, how can we open this up to more women? And then our education will be designed for both genders. And be willing to share the little teeny bit of what we think is power associated with our positions with other persons, to be honest about the damage that this kind of abuse does is a big step, because I think in the past we have been unwilling to acknowledge the real damage that happens. And then as communities of faith, we might have to take a greater role in being a safe place for women and children who want to escape this violence. Because if we're saying to them that we want these unions to stay together, then we have to be responsible with saying, okay, that mom and her daughter and her child, they can come and stay with me while they're going to counseling with their faith leader. If that's the goal, we have to team up. We have to all be a part, the legal system. So there's all this training that has to go on at every level. And those are all male organizations. The police, those are male organizations. The law, those are male organizations. Our denominational hierarchies are male organizations. So we have to be willing to speak. We cannot let our voices be silenced. There is a risk. There's a risk to my speaking today. There's a risk to Anita speaking, to Salima speaking. There's a risk. There's going to be pushback on, well, how dare you? We cannot be silent. We have to, as Jesus would say, take on our cross and follow God into the way of truth, the way of reconciliation, the way of love, the way of no hierarchy, the way of an egalitarian, open community that is accepting of everyone, who they are and how they are, and to love everyone. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And so we're nowhere near even scratching the surface of being able to change this tide. Because I love what Halima said. I'm gonna quote you. Patriarchy is the water we swim in. And until we accept that the water has too much chlorine in it, too many chemicals, and get those chemicals out of the water, we're still swimming in it. We like swimming in it. And so I think we have to take the chemicals out of the water and roll up our sleeves, ladies, men, women, girls. And I think the reason for pulling up our sleeves is our grandchildren. We want our grandchildren to live in a world where abuse is down. We want our grandchildren to live in a world where they're accepted for who they are in equal partnership, under love, that our faith would be stronger. So we do this work for our grandchildren. At least that's why I do it.
Salima, for the last comment, what bright spots have you seen in your own faith community that elicit these ideas of allies and collaboration and really getting to the heart of problems of violence in the community?
Yeah, there have been a couple off the top of my head. So one is, I think, just seeing networks of solidarity grow. So Muslim women finding one another, women in queer communities working together. I think various women of color, right? So Muslim women, like Black Muslim women working with Black Christian women, like I think Muslim women working with Jewish women, like I think building those networks of solidarity has been such a source of joy for me over the past few years in this work, and just watching women and queer folk and people whose voices just aren't heard forcing it, like, because we're done waiting. And that's a real source of joy for me. And I think part of the product of that has been that then from a place of strength, we can say, yeah, we're going to include men in this conversation. And so I was on the board for the local chapter of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women for a long time. And they have a program where they talk specifically about engaging men and boys and ending violence in families. And so like to facilitate the program, you had at least one man and usually one of us from the board helping to facilitate. And it was intended to speak to community leaders in particular. And it's wonderful. Like it covers most of the ground that we covered here and really helps to ground it in faith as well as a moral imperative, right? And I think that's the point in the end, is that the moral imperative to justice is a moral imperative for us all. And it's one that we share across traditions and regardless of gender and regardless of sexual expression and regardless of whatever else might divide us. And so we all need to get on board with that, right? Like it's not an optional clause for any of us in our faith to say that justice can wait. And so I think I at least have seen that gain momentum in a way where a lot of us have said, get on board, or like, we're leaving without you. And I'm kind of a fan of that, honestly. I think it's time. I think we've hit that point, and I think it's time for us to just get moving. So that's been nice.
And this has been so enriching. I had one question for Anita, and it had to do with the collection of race-based data that was me in terms of evidence that dealing with the increased violence between 20 and 30% post-COVID, and that data is not collected by race in terms of ways in which, how do we better facilitate services to be provided in a much more holistic way with Canada's demographics changing so rapidly. Do you want to say something about that briefly, Anita?
I've always been an advocate for thoughtful big data collection. The more we know, the more we can pinpoint where the resources have to go. I think there's a reluctance sometimes because the powers that be think that there's going to be a competition amongst communities. But I think, if taking Salima's thoughts forward, we're just not going to take it anymore. And we're going to demand that the resources be put where we need the resources to be put. And if that means that there is a differentiation amongst the communities, as long as it's thoughtful and insightful into what the needs are, but we can't make that assessment unless there's an investment in it. Look, the bottom line is that domestic violence has a huge cost, not only emotionally or physically and the well-being of our children, but when I'm asked to justify why we have diversity and inclusion training, sometimes you have to go to the numbers. You'll say to a firm, you want to do diversity and inclusion because it'll mean you'll get more business. sometimes you have to talk the economic talk, right? Domestic violence has a huge economic factor in marriage breakdown and business breakdown and diversion of police resources. And let's not get started on that one. So if we can collect the data that will help us pinpoint how to deal with those financial burdens, as well as the physical and emotional, in a way that will make our society as a whole stronger and better, then why wouldn't we? I hope some government people are listening.
Hear, hear. Well, this has been an exceptional conversation. And I have learned so much, and the depth of your perspectives, I think, leaves room to ask even more questions and to at least begin for those who came tonight to listen and learn about this subject, that the beginning is now. If you haven't thought about this, you are now initiated into the conversation, and now you have an obligation to pay it forward in your own communities. And so I want to thank Cheryl, Hanna, and Salima, Versi, and Anita Brumberg for giving us your time, your energy, your passion, and your knowledge this evening. And as we bring this to a close, I want to announce what's going on in the future. The next event that will happen will be February 6th from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Our second community forum, an email will be sent to the community. There's a reminder to spread the word, join us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube channel, LinkedIn. And then if you want to contact someone, you can email at info@maamawatali.org or mail us at P.O. Box 53124, Rideau Center in Ottawa. And special thanks to the funders who made this event possible, the Government of Canada through Employment and Social Development, Canada funding administered by the Canadian Red Cross. Thank you so much for attending this evening, and let the conversation continue. God bless you.